The Great Irish Famine began in 1845 and was caused by a devastating fungus that developed in the potato crop. While this kind of blight was an act of nature, the British government was so negligent in dealing with this catastrophe that it resulted in 1 million people dying from starvation and diseases of malnutrition in Ireland. Another 2 million people had to leave the country within the decade, so the population of Ireland was reduced by about a third over this time. This fiasco led to a deep resentment of British rule that fueled generations of Irish nationalism, both in Ireland and for all of the Irish immigrants in America. The potato blight at this time was actually affecting many countries in Europe. However, the worst effects occurred in Ireland because the people were already so poor, and the British government utterly failed to alleviate the situation. By the 1800s, the Irish were quite dependent on the potato as a monocrop. It meant that having the blight that rots all of the potatoes would be very devastating on the people. The British had essentially practiced colonialism in Ireland for hundreds of years, and one of the key aspects of British rule was that land in Ireland was in the hands of mainly Anglo-Irish lords, many of whom did not even live in Ireland. This was problematic because the peasants were exploited by middlemen who were focused on maximizing profit from the land and felt no responsibility for their tenants. In fact, these middlemen were described as land sharks or bloodsuckers. Another problem of the absentee landlords is that the money they earned in rents was being taken out of the Irish economy and spent in Britain instead. Ireland was set up as an agricultural economy that focused on exporting cattle and grain to Britain. With this goal in mind, the potato was intentionally introduced as the main staple for the poor Irish peasants. The Irish hadn't always been dependent on just the potato. However, the potato was advantageous for the landlords. It is, after all, nutritious, can be grown in large quantities to feed the peasants without depleting the soil, thus leaving a much larger percentage of the estate for grain crops and cattle for export to England. Even when the famine was occurring, grain and other foods were being exported from Ireland. While the British leaders would argue that they were importing food to Ireland as well, this justification does not work because so many people still starved to death. Others have pointed to the idea that there had been enough food, but that it had not been distributed to the worst areas of the famine in the south and west of Ireland. Either way, it is indefensible to export food when so many people were dying of hunger. The absentee Anglo landlords and their middlemen ruthlessly evicted families from their homes when their crops failed and they could not pay their rent. Having neither food nor shelter made things even worse for people who were already in dire straits. The British government did try to help by setting up soup kitchens and workhouses. The soup kitchens were actually effective in feeding millions of people. However, the program was very short-lived and lasted only for 6 months in 1847. The famine was over 5 years long, so why was it discontinued? Unfortunately, some of the key British leaders during this time believed in a laissez faire approach. Laissez faire is the belief that the government should interfere as little as possible. So even though the soup kitchens were not very expensive and were actually helping people, it was ended early. The politicians rationalized that the famine was coming to an end in 1847, when in fact evidence was showing just the opposite. If the politicians had cared, they would have seen that an end was not in sight. The poor law system was in place for providing relief by taking in the poor in workhouses. However, the famine was so bad that the workhouses were hugely overcrowded and simply terrible places to be. There were all kinds of obstacles, and rather than providing generous relief to those in need, there was this misguided notion by the British leaders to, number one, keep expenses down, and number two, to make the Irish poor more self-sufficient. To make matters worse, many who went to the workhouses were so desperate, and some were already sick. So diseases spread quickly, and a malnourished people with a weakened immune system couldn't fight off these kinds of diseases. There were actually very high mortality rates in the workhouses. The lack of funding for workhouses and soup kitchens meant that more people died. Sir Charles Wood, Chancellor of the Exchequer, responsible for financial affairs, had a Protestant evangelical belief in divine providence, that somehow the famine was God's will. This was a popular sentiment at the time. Sir Charles Trevelyan, the British civil servant responsible for administering Irish relief policy, was another proponent. So this was a rationale for the British politicians to spend as little as possible. With this moralistic attitude of the time, people who believed that the famine was a visitation from the Almighty God and that they should not meddle with God's will. So two pretty high-level people came to the terrible conclusion that somehow God was trying to reorganize Irish society with this horrific famine, and this justified their inaction and negligence. There were attempts at public works projects, but again, the moralistic attitude of Trevelyan doomed them to failure. They paid workers far below market wages, and therefore workers earned less in food than the calories they needed to actually do the physical work of building roads. Since the famine went on for so long, even people who initially cared eventually developed compassion fatigue. The justification for the lack of help could also be tied into the racial and cultural stereotypes about the Irish people and Catholicism during that time. The Irish were seen by the British as backward, uncouth, lazy, and worst of all, dependent. The Irish immigrants in the US and Canada suffered from racism and discrimination as well. However, they go on to become very important contributors to building these nations in North America. The flood of Irish into America had a profound effect, especially in urban centers where the Irish exerted political influence and got involved in municipal government. In the Civil War, entire regiments were composed of Irish troops, such as those of the New York's famed Irish Brigade. For the Irish diaspora, the famine was an important part of their story, and for generations, it meant a connection to their home country in the fight for independence. Even Karl Marx was heavily influenced by events happening in Ireland, as he wrote in London, quote, "Ireland was swept away by the economic forces that emanated from one of the most powerful and aggressive states the world had ever known. It suffered not from a fungus, but from conquest, theft, bondage, protectionism, government welfare, public works, and inflation." The famine resulted in complex political consequences. There had been an attempt at rebellion in the ravaged Ireland of 1848, which was, of course, doomed to failure, though many of the leaders of that failed rebellion would soon regroup at home and in exile to support the clandestine Fenian movement. This movement was dedicated to establishing an independent Irish republic, by force if required. But at a deep level, the famine raised fundamental questions regarding the legitimacy of the authority of the British state and Parliament in Ireland. Thousands of Irish among the diaspora shared the verdict of their fellow nationalists at home that the famine provided conclusive evidence that Ireland must be freed. Therefore, the careless mistakes made by the British Whig government not only led to a high death toll and suffering, but also fueled Irish nationalism and an independence movement. In fact, even today, the peace in Northern Ireland is a touchy and tenuous one, as we can see in the peace walls that are still in place in Belfast. Thank you very much for watching History Blenders. If you enjoyed our video, please give us a like and subscribe.